Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. And the Moorcock flavour is strong in this one, for a couple of reasons. One is that this is our annual celebratory birthday show, where we laud the works of the man himself, his further year on this planet, and Phil's, of course, because they share that birthday. Another is that on this show, I'm joined by the birthday boy, Buggerly Otherly himself, Mike. He turns 85 the day this podcast uploads, and that means it's Phil's birthday too. So I'm also joined by the birthday girl, and, as is our wont, we decamps to our frequent haunt, Morecambe, to eat, drink, soak in the bay atmos, peruse the old pier bookshop, and do a bit of reading and chatting to celebrate another year on the globe for her too. As it happens, due to a message from our old mucker Lord Samper back in 2019, when we put out our very first birthday special, we adopted this date as our official podcast birthday too. So in that case, we're like royalty. And there's a third reason too, that this is a special one. It's episode 100. So it really is a conjunction of the spheres. So sit back on your luxury divan, take another draught of Vortex water, and join us as we do our thing. But in this case, in some rather special company.
The sea across from Morecambe.
Yes.
it was horrible.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, we pass that area fairly frequently because although we live in Bradford, Morecambe is one of our favourite places. So we head down that road past Ingleton on a fairly regular basis. In fact, we'll be there in a couple of weeks.
Oh, good.
Because we just love Morecambe Bay so much. And
Yes.
we got chatting one day to a guy, an old retired RAF guy, funnily enough called Andy, who runs a bar there called Embargo. And he said that back in the day, people in Morecambe used to call Morecambe Little Bradford because everybody from Bradford went on their holidays
really?
there.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's a fairly easy route, as it were, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, just straight past Skipton, and you're on your way.
Right. Absolutely. We always used to stop in Bradford because they used to have a very good Indian restaurant there, and so when we were heading south, we always made sure we stopped in Bradford.
Yeah.
We nearly got killed, the whole family, by the Morecambe boar. We didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where everybody else knew except us. I don't know why, but my then wife and 3 kids, we were all out there on the sands, and it's only when we got back that we realised that we just missed the boar coming in. So
it can be really dangerous that day, can't it?
Yeah.
Oh well, fortunately, you got away with it on that occasion. Yeah.
Carol Bonfilioli. Do you know the guy who used to edit Science Fantasy?
I don't know.
He lived at Silverdale, which is just up from Morecambe, or not that far up from Morecambe anyway.
Yeah.
And he lived there for quite a few years.
It's funny you should mention Bradford Curries. I mean, I'm from Hull originally, and my partner. Well, now I keep calling my partner. We got married about a month ago. She's now my wife. She's from Grimsby, but she's lived in Bradford for 30 plus years, and I moved here to move in with her 20 years ago. And when you say Bradford's a good place for a curry, well, I don't think I could ever move away, to be honest, for that entire reason.
Right.
But do you know what? On this podcast, Mike, we are fairly well known for digressions, and we've kicked off in that respect already by talking about Morecambe and curries. But it seems odd saying this when these are just contrivances for this podcast and the direct references to your work, but welcome to Derry and Tom's and to the Breakfast in the Ruins podcast, Mike Moorcock. It's lovely to have you.
Hi, nice to be here.
Now, I suppose as a bit of background and context, this is our 100th episode and our 5th birthday episode. But that doesn't refer to the birthday of the podcast, but rather your birthday, because we twigged quite early on that you and Phil, my wife, share a birthday, 18th of December, which is a very strange coincidence. So we got into the habit of putting out a podcast on the 18th of December to celebrate both. So, happy birthday to you for the 18th of December.
Thank you.
Phil sends a love too, and best wishes to you and Linda from Phil.
Okay.
Now,
Thank you.
We normally ask
But,
new guests about their history with Moorcock and genre fiction, but you are Michael Moorcock, so it seems like a bit of a redundant question. Although certainly the first part of that is a moot point, although I might turn it on its head and revisit it later. But the second part, what was your way into the genre? I think that's a fairly good starting point.
well, it was, I think, well, into the genre itself. It was my dad ran off when I was 5,
Yeah.
just at the end of World War II in Europe. I'm not, anyway. As soon as the war was over, he was never in the war, he so he was one of the men. He was the only man in the office of about 50 women. So it was a terrible temptation for him. So he disappeared.
Yeah.
But he left behind two of those little tiny Methuen red Edgar Rice Burroughs books that they used to put out, and one was Son of Tarzan, and the other was Mastermind of Mars. And and I was an early reader, so I read whatever was in the house, which was a very weird collection of books because my mother read a lot, but she borrowed from the library. But my dad didn't really leave much behind in the way of books, and those are the only things I had. Those and a couple of other. I had a George Bernard Shaw, which was weird, and a couple of others, Victorian books, which I read them all because that's what there was to read. But it was the Burroughs, of course, that got me going. And then when I was 14, actually, I started an Edgar Rice Burroughs fanzine, and that's how I basically made contact with fandom, with science fiction fandom.
Yeah. What was it about things like Edgar Rice? But because, of course, you were a child. Your formative years as a very young child were during London during the war,
Yeah.
and the ruins of London. And I know that London is a very strong theme running through a lot of your books. What was it about those books that appealed to you so much? Because, of course, you were a voracious reader, but what was it about things like Burroughs that really appealed to you?
I really don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I didn't have much to compare him with, of course. So it wasn't like I was going across a big spectrum of potential books. But I, well, the Son of Tarzan, I didn't know there was a Tarzan. I just knew there was a Son of Tarzan because that's the only book I read.
Right, yeah.
And it just had a really great atmosphere for me. I mean, it was very vivid. And I think that's Burroughs's essentially his main attraction is the vividness of his writing, because he wasn't a great writer, he wasn't a great plotter, but he could really bring that stuff to life. And it was the same with Mastermind of Mars, which is probably one of the worst of the Martian books, but for me it was wonderful. Yeah, I mean that's all I can say about it, really. I mean, I think what attracted me to fantasy, because I was a fantasy fan really more than a science fiction fan, was the imagery. It was that in Edgar Rice Burroughs, certainly, and then I suppose I got on to, I'm not sure, Lee Brackett, I think, would have been the next writer I read, because she was in magazines and you could get those very cheaply, the English editions. And so, and then Robert E. Howard really was a bit later because he was hard to come by. Even then, Weird Tales was expensive. Although they were 3 and 6 a piece. I mean, that was a lot of money. So I had 1 or 2 Weird Tales fairly early on. And then I didn't really read much in the way of science fiction until I read Tiger Tiger by Alfred Bester. And that really turned me on to that kind of science fiction, what I'd call galaxy science fiction.
Yeah.
I was never an analog or astounding reader. It was never the sort of stuff that appealed to me. So I couldn't get into Asimov or Heinlein or any of the sort of big astounding writers. They just somehow didn't do it for me. Although I've enjoyed the TV series of Foundation. I mean, which actually got pretty good.
Mm.
So yeah, that was it really. Then it was just, once I was in fandom, that's what really opened up all the other potential authors that I could read. Although I read Mervyn Peake fairly early, and I knew Peake, so that was a very early kind of I don't know what influence.
Yeah.
And T.H. White, I used to correspond with T.H. White, and he was very kind. He used to send me his books, which, like an idiot, at one point, when I was broke and I suppose needed food for the family, I can't think of any other reason. I sold a lot, and really, it's my big regret that I did that. It felt like I was betraying him too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was in touch both with writers and fans, from about the age of 14, 15.
Yeah.
And Jim Cawthorne was a big help to me. He told me a lot of the writers that he liked, and and lent me the books.
Yeah.
We used to do it all by post in those days.
Yeah. So how do you go from being this voracious reader and being the editor of fanzines and contributing short stories to magazines to all of a sudden, in a very short space of time, becoming really a sci-fi and fantasy publishing phenomenon in the late 60s, and at one point I think putting out 23 novels in 6 years?
Yeah, well, I actually put out 11 books in 1 year. I can't remember now what it was, but I used to say, "Blimey, I've done 11 books." And one of those, I think it must have been 76 or 7, because one of them won the Guardian Fiction Awards.
Yeah.
It was quite a good year for me. But I think it was probably because from editing fanzines, by sheer luck, I suppose, I did an interview with the editor of Tarzan Adventures magazine, who was just an old Fleet Street hack who was doing a job. He wasn't interested, and I was very disappointed in his lack of enthusiasm for Burroughs. So I wrote this article in the fanzine saying how much I disliked him, basically. And he wrote back to me saying, "You'll never work in Fleet Street again," or words to that effect. But happily, he was disliked by all the other people at the firm.
Yeah.
So when he was leaving, they wrote to me and said, "Would you like a job?" So I got a job first as assistant editor and then editor at Tarzan Adventures.
Yeah.
And that's how I got in. And then I became a journalist, really. I mean, an all-purpose journalist. I wrote on every subject there was to write on, really. Anything. I wrote a series on cathedrals without ever actually visiting one of the cathedrals. I just imagined what they were like.
Yeah.
I mean, I obviously had guidebooks and stuff like that, but I never actually tried. Jimmy Ballard actually pinched my cathedrals for his taxes because he knew that I wasn't putting them down as per tax returns, and so he put down visits to cathedrals and anyway, so yeah, and I just became used to, if somebody wanted a job of some kind, whatever it was, really, fiction or non-fiction, within a day or two, I could do it, easily. And sometimes it was, the same day.
Yeah.
So I got used to writing very quickly. I think you'll find that almost anybody who's got my capacity was also a journalist at some point, and then just got used to. And also, my mother was very supportive. She sent me to Pitman's to learn shorthand and typing.
Yeah.
I was no good at shorthand, but I was very good at typing. So I could type very quickly. I mean, Linda used to say it was disheartening to hear me in another room just banging away, you know, um, uh, as it were.
Yeah, yeah.
But apparently, I could do, I think, something like 200 words a minute, which is apparently very good.
Right.
I that's a lot of it. Was I could just they just used to flow out of me, really.
Yeah. That reminds me of a couple of things. I seem to remember reading a quote. I think it was from Sterling Siliphant when someone said, "What's your secret to writing?" He said, "Never stop writing." And so from I guess from the late 50s, you just never did stop writing.
No, I never did. I still can't. I mean, as Linda says, I've always got a story that I'm doing, even if
Mm.
it's a little short story. I just, for some reason, I've always got a story, you know. And I got expelled from school, from my boarding school, which I was rather glad of because I was always running away from it anyway. But it was a nice school. They were, you know, they were kind people, nice people. But I used to keep the other kids up, telling them stories
Yeah.
about my my fictitious adventures in the jungles of Africa, based on the Mowgli stories in the jungles of India, by Kipling, because
Yeah.
Kipling is a very liberal school, and Kipling was sort of wasn't in the library, so I could get away with telling them the Mowgli stories as my own experience.
Yeah.
But they eventually caught me when I got up a tree and couldn't get down again.
Oh, what a way to get busted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so in the 60s, I mean, one of the most interesting things I think about your, I don't know, your legend, the idea of Michael Moorcock, I suppose, rather than Mike the person, is there's this really strong connection between you, fantasy, the counterculture, and no doubt your work was massively appealing to the counterculture in the 60s and the 70s, but I was introduced to your books by my granddad, who we call Pops, who was my paternal granddad. And so the early 80s, he was reading all of your books in the 60s, the 70s. In fact, I've got the copy of Warlord of the Air here.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The actual book that he gave me at the
Oh
time.
right.
So this was the first ever book I ever read by you, and the other one was, I think, the Stormbringer pocketbook, Ace pocketbook edition of Stormbringer with the
Mm-hmm.
Jack Gowan
Yeah,
cover.
yeah.
And so, although there's this idea that your books were really popular with the counterculture, really popular with that kind of new wave stuff, Pops was a World War II veteran. He was an electrician. His son, my Uncle John, was a gas fitter. They were just young fella. He was a young fella just in Hull, working class blokes, you know, salt of the earth. What kind of sense did you have about your readership when you were in the middle of this massive rush of creativity?
Well, the impression I was given by Bram Stokes, you know, the guy who used to run the bookshop,
Hmm.
was that they were all speed freaks. But I don't think it's been true, because I don't think that at the time, you know, I was selling so many books. Not that I ever got paid for them. I learned several years later that I hadn't. You know, that I wasn't getting paid for any of these books that was selling like hotcakes.
Yeah.
Or I mean, I wasn't getting royalties.
Hmm.
It was, I had a terrible agent and terrible contracts, so I didn't really benefit a huge amount from that particular period.
Yeah.
But I knew it had to be more than just, you know, just a bunch of speed freaks and musicians, because musicians, it was real my real sort of entry into music was through those books,
Hmm.
because pretty much everybody in the music business who read at all read my books. I don't know why, but it was just one of those things. You know, David Bowie read them, and you know, people like that, but also a lot of the R&B people, the old blues players,
Yeah.
read them too. So, but I think probably for, you know, for working class people, it was the same as me writing them, in a
Hmm.
sense, in that, you know, it was a better world. It was a more colourful world. It
Hmm.
took you right out of the ordinary humdrum world that you were born into.
Hmm.
So I don't think it's that much of a mystery why you would want, or at least if you had an imagination, why you would want to do that. I mean, there were plenty of people who, of course, didn't, but
yeah. I mean, that's how I found them. Pops had a rocking chair, and he had a little coffee table with one of those ashtrays when you pushed the thing,
yeah,
the button down, it
everything
span
disappeared.
and
Yeah,
everything
that's
disappeared.
right. Yeah,
And on his coffee table next to his rocking chair, there were always 2 or 3 paperbacks, and they always changed. They were constantly changing. And I remember seeing Warlord of the Air on there, and I remember seeing The Broken Sword on there, and a Bruce Pennington covered Dune book. And every time we went, we're living in Hull, a fishing port that's losing its industry, that was incredibly drab, and all of my memories of the 1970s, it's all beige. Everything's beige or shades of brown or cream.
yeah,
But my memories of their house were always these wonderful garish covered paperbacks. And what amazes me, actually, about something you've said already, is a lot of those books, a lot of the Mayflower editions of your books with the Bob Haberfield covers, still to this day, if you go in the right second-hand bookshops, and there's a great one in Morecambe called the Old Pier Bookshop, there are still, you will find dozens and dozens and dozens of your books from the 60s and 70s. And it absolutely blows my mind to think that they are so ubiquitous still to this day. I mean, they were in the 80s. In the 80s, the first book of yours I ever bought myself with my own money was this, the Savoy edition of My Experiences in the Third World War.
yeah,
And which absolutely blew my mind because it's also got a picture of you in it.
yeah.
And to me, age something like 12, I was like, holy shit, this guy looks like Grizzly Adams. And Grizzly Adams was my favourite guy on TV. So and it absolutely blows my mind to think that they were produced in such vast numbers that you were just paid like a one-off contract to write them, and then that was it.
Yeah, well, what happened was that there's a firm called Mayflower Books, which is a relatively small paperback publisher, and it was run by a bloke called Joe Pacey. Joe Pacey had been a builder. He was straight working class, but somehow he got into publishing paperbacks, and he was very easy to deal with. This is what I liked about him. I mean, what happened was, as I said, I had a terrible. I mean, I liked my agent, but she was really not a very good agent. But nonetheless, I went in to see Joe one day because he thought he'd been told that fantasy was the upcoming thing. I'd already sold some stuff in America and in hardback, and so I went in there, and Joe says, "Well, Michael, you got a few fantasy novels you want to flog?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, how about 150 quid a piece?" I said, "All right, fine." We shook hands, and that was it. I mean, that was Stormbringer, Stealer of Souls, and the Hawkmoon books, ultimately. And then talking about Bob Haberfield, his art editor came up with some potential covers, and they were awful. They were the usual kind of quasi-medieval things that they tended to put on things in those days. And I said, they're terrible, but on the floor standing on the floor upright across from him were some really good paintings. I thought they were really good. And I said, let's have him. And it was Bob Haberfield. So we started pretty much at exactly the same time in terms of, the mass public, as it were.
Yeah.
And I always felt Bob had done a lot of good for the books, that he did some great covers for those books. So altogether, it was a happy meeting. They then got bought out by Panther, who then got bought out by Granada, and then it went on like that. But that was the first. I'm hoping that was your question, because I can't remember what it was.
Yeah. No, I'm quite happy to just have a rolling chat about this stuff.
Yeah.
I had a chat to Bob's son, Ben, on the podcast about 2 years ago, because Bob sadly passed away.
Yes,
and Ben said that his dad loved doing those, and he's actually been rediscovering a lot of the original paintings.
Well, he wrote to me. Ben wrote to me, and I put him in touch with John Davey, who is essentially my editor and bibliographer, but a friend as well. And John is helping him get a book together, as well as he said to me, could I sell these? And I said, don't sell them. I said, put them out as posters. Keep the originals.
Yeah.
Or if you're going to sell the originals, make sure you've got posters and the usual stuff that went with them, with those images. So now he's doing T-shirts and God knows what. Turned into a cottage industry.
Yeah, he messaged me a couple of weeks ago and he's very kindly sending me a Winds. He gave me the choice of any of the T-shirts, so I went for a Winds of Limbo.
Oh yeah,
because
nice.
I love that cover, absolutely. And again, that edition of Winds of Limbo is one of the ones I picked up from Pops's coffee table back in the day. So it's there's a lovely circularity to it all. It's fabulous.
Well, Jim Cawthorne, who did the first Elric pictures, Jim was from all his family were workers in the shipping industry in Newcastle,
right?
And but at the same time they weren't just steel workers or shipping workers. They read a lot as well. So Jim got his taste from his dad, I think. And so here's you talk about sort of grimy. I don't remember there was more than one colour in Newcastle when I first went there, which was grey and smoke. And I went up there during the war for some reason, and it's my memory of Newcastle. I think I did have relatives up there.
Yeah.
Why I was evacuated to one of the other main bombed towns in England, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it was they were trying to get rid of me, but that anyway, that was Jim. So I think, and when you think of it, nearly all British musicians came out of the sort of working or what you might call lower middle class.
God,
So so we were all part of the same discovery of color in a way, and sort of vivid imagery and so on.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the greatest creativity, especially in music, came from grim industrial towns, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's funny growing up in Hull, and I won't hear a word against Hull. I love it. I mean, I live in Bradford now. I've lived in Bradford for the best part of 20 years, but I like Bradford because it's so similar to Hull. It's just more diverse. But growing up as a kid in Hull, if the wind was blowing in one direction, you could smell the fish docks. If it was blowing in the other direction, you could smell the tannery.
Yeah.
And on a good day, you could smell neither. And that dominates most of my memories. So getting access to stuff like this and, this wild escapism and all these things were just so incredibly stimulating for the imagination, for me and lots of my friends. So none of us were... Well, I mean, a couple of us were, but none of us were in bands. Most of my friends, like my occasional co-host Loz, a lot of the other guys who were my age who come on the podcast, were all from very, very similar northern backgrounds, very similar towns, very similar tastes,
Dave Britton, for instance. Dave Britton was working in a factory before he actually started Savoy Books.
Yeah.
But he swore he'd never go back into that factory. He just remembered just how horrible it was.
Yeah.
And so, he did everything to make sure he'd never, although he went to prison twice, but
yeah.
He said it was actually better than the factory. So there you go.
Yeah, I was thinking back to that period, and I suppose I'm thinking back to a couple of things you've said now. You've talked about how fast a writer you were, and and a lot of your readers were speed freaks. I think it's a confluence of those two things in my mind over the last 30 or 40 years that some of my friends have had, and it's probably a misconception, but I promised myself I'd try and get to the truth behind your 3-day book process and separate it from the legend that's developed in my head that you just knock them out on 3-day speed benders and rattle them out and throw the pages over your shoulder to someone behind you. How disciplined were you when it came to
I was very
this?
disciplined. I mean, I had an extremely strong... I mean, I was very lucky in that my mother was very, very supportive of me, as I said. So she sort of... once I said I wanted to be a writer, which was when... I think it was before I was 9 anyway. She decided that, okay, but you'd have to have a trade as a writer. You can't just be an airy-fairy writer. So she that's why she sent me to Pitman's after I failed my 11 plus. I went to Pitman's to learn typing and shorthand, which is nearly all girls, of course, learning secretarial stuff, which is also very nice. And so that was, that was. I mean, I grew up. I left school at 15. I never expected not to leave school at 15. The idea of university was very, very remote. There were a few people I knew, but not many. Well, with that ambition, I mean, not who actually went. And so, I got a job at 15. Well, I got one job at 15 that I only lasted a day, but the next job I got was essentially I was a messenger. I was going around for a shipping company in the city, and so I'd go to the docks, down to the docks, which at that point, of course, were full of ships, and then up to the as it were, southwest London, where all the embassies were. So I was going from, grim London up to posh London on a regular basis, and getting a lot of experience from that. But sorry, you were asking about the legend. It's not really a legend. It's how I worked. I mean, what happened was I got married at 22. We had our first kid when I was 23, and of course I had to support them. And I'd been blacklisted by Fleetway because I'd been in the union and been involved in union activity, and they didn't like that. So I had to do most of the work I did when I got back from Sweden under pseudonym or my wife's name. Anyway, so I had essentially I was working a 5-day week rather than a 7-day week, as I remember anyway. But I only had 3 days in which I could write a book, because I could write a comic for more money and get more money for it than I would get in advance for a book. So I worked out that 3 days was the only amount, the maximum amount of time I had in which to produce the same amount of money as I would get for a comic, but with the potential of getting royalties. I mean, I suppose I thought this through quite well, given how young I was. I mean, I know that I didn't want to wind up an embittered old journalist on Tiger Comic, although I wrote a lot for Tiger Comic, but and they did pay well, so and I could do those easily in a day, a day or overnight. I'd do those little square comic books, Thriller Library. I could do one of those overnight, and I'd get 50 guineas for that, and that was a lot of money. I mean, that was the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
So I had to make sure that I could get at least as much money from a book as I could from a comic or a piece of journalism of some kind. I was doing a lot of feature work as well. I was working with Barry Bailey, who's my partner, and we both, he couldn't write as fast as I could, and my wife we were a partnership. We were splitting the income, and of course I was doing most of the work, just because I could do most of the work. And my wife got very, very upset with that, because she said, you're giving half your money to this bloke, and he's sitting in the pub and all that, and it wasn't. I mean, she didn't really realize the how that worked, because Barry had a lot of really good ideas, and anyway, so what I did was I worked out the shortest paperback. The shortest paperback you could do was 45,000 words for a novel, and so that meant I had 3 days in which I could write 45,000 words if I wrote 15,000 words a day, and I'd literally work 9 to 6, with an hour off for lunch. I mean, I worked a straight, disciplined day.
Yeah.
I didn't use any drugs. I didn't use any booze. I did have strong coffee, and
Yeah.
and and um, and that was it. I mean,
Yeah.
and so I'd sit there and you're quite right. Jim Cawthorne used to. What I used to do was either I would, if it was a really tight deadline, it didn't really happen too much with many books. Um, I would throw the pages over my shoulder effectively, or actually put them on the floor. And Jim would gather a few up and start editing it, which would mean there was very little to edit. I was a
Yeah.
good speller, luckily, and um, I couldn't spell sandal for some reason, and I couldn't spell saddle, both
Yeah.
of which are necessary in Saunderson. um, but Jim was very good at that. He was a very good speller. I was a very good speller, but he was too.
Yeah.
And so he'd read them, and I wouldn't read them. I never read them. I wrote them. I still haven't read most of them. I wrote them. Um, Jim would read them for any possible errors,
Yeah.
and then they would go straight into the post, and off to they were going to America first. That was my main market then. Lots of books, and then Ace Books, and yeah. So it's true. I mean, I did them in 3 days, but it wasn't like I wrote War and Peace in 3 days. I mean, these were short novels, and as you can tell from the omnibuses now, I mean, 4 of those make a good sized novel now.
Yeah.
But it was all worked out in terms of straight economics and and what I could afford to do.
Yeah. Just a business-like approach. Yeah.
Yes, I mean I had to really. I was. It was just a professional, way of. I mean, I just came. I came from a family of hardworking people. My mother, the day my father left, my mother went out and got a job in a factory,
Yeah.
in a timber factory, and she was on the benches pulling nails out of. They had to recycle timber,
Yeah.
pulling nails out of old boxes and
Yeah.
stuff. On a sort of on a line, whatever they call it,
Yeah.
that line.
Yeah.
um, Although she did eventually become the director of that company, so she was, I think, well, I was lucky. I know that Dave Britton's mum was like that too. I mean, she had the same sort of experience, and she they went into shops. I mean, she got started a shop, I think, and
Yeah.
that's how she got on. But quite a lot of people I knew at that time, of course, because of the war, were fatherless, and I'm not entirely sure that I would have done as well if I'd have had a father leaning over me saying, what you doing now, rather than a mother saying, good on you, because that was really, mothers dote on their sons, or frequently dote on their sons.
Yeah.
So I had good backing.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned your omnibuses. So I think one of the intriguing things about reading your stories in narrative order, as newer readers will do these days, rather than the order in which they were written, is that the reader gets to experience very different writing and narrative styles. Because how do you judge the evolution of your storytelling from those 3-day book days through the 70s and into the 80s, when you were writing longer form things like City in the Autumn Stars or Gloriana or the Pyatt novels?
Well, I gave my again. It's a slightly Germanic approach. I mean, if you think, in that I developed a life plan, in that I thought I saw that a lot of science fiction writers or imaginative writers were good until they were about 30, and then they tended to repeat themselves, become repetitious,
Yeah.
and and I didn't want to do that. So I gave myself until I was 30 to learn the trade, which meant that I read a lot, and I read for structure and how dialogue was carried and character was created, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I read an enormous amount of late 19th century, early 20th century fiction, which is a kind of high point of well, the kind of stuff I liked anyway. And so I just approached all of that with the same sort of. I actually did a book with Colin Greenland called "Death Is No Obstacle," where Mike Butterworth and Dave Britton of Savoy said, "Would I write a book about technique and how I structured things?" And I said I wouldn't do that because I've got no message for anybody on how to, because we all have our own methods of doing things. But I could tell them how I solved problems, how I solved technical problems. So the book is basically Colin asking me, how I solved a particular technical problem in a particular book. And all of the books have a very straight, a good, solid structure. I mean, they've got a, as it were, a good engineering base to them. So Gloriana I use the seasons in that to give it shape, and mood as well. And and I also use music. I mean, I was very interested in music. I mean, classical music from an early age. Although I like rock and roll as well, but in fact, I actually didn't like rock and roll much until the great days of rock and roll started. So I used Mozart as a model for short books. So I used what they call it's basically sonata form for things like the Hawkmoon books. But I used for Piat and the big long books, I used Wagner, where he used a lot of leitmotifs started very early on in the books, which only emerge a bit later. And I also, I used Wagner as a model for the overall, people say I just write one book, and then essentially I am writing one huge book.
Yeah.
So I'm putting motifs into an early book, say, which I'll take up in a later book, either expand on or refer back to, and that way it saves you having to go all over the same. That's my cat. I don't know if you can hear her, but she wants to come into this room and she's not allowed in here. Anyway, so that it was all. I mean, you could say it was very calculated, and the amount of time and effort and thought that I put into a book depended very much on the level of literary ambition that it had. But they're all, as it were, mounted on very solid frames. And what I found was that if you did that, if you got your structure right, if you got your sense of what you had to do, you knew where you had to put certain elements, so that you never got to a point where you were bugged, or rarely got to a point. I've just got to a point now, so I'm lying actually, but up until this last book, you never got to a point where you were stuck, where people say, I've got writer's block, or I can't know how to go on. Because I worked out that if you got the structure right, then you knew what you had to put into that structure to make the whole thing work. So that's what I did.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but it's funny you should mention your cat, because the last podcast we were recording, we were talking about The King of the Swords, and my co-host on that occasion, Simon, made an observation when we were talking about Whiskers, Jerry's cat, that you must be a cat owner.
Oh yeah, because that's a real cat in that.
Really? Whiskers. Oh, tell us about Whiskers.
Yeah. Oh well, I mean, except that you couldn't fly. That's the only difference, really.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I've had cats. I've had dogs as well, but I've had cats all my life. Cats are good in some ways, better than dogs because they like to sit and work with you. And you know that flap on a desk that comes out, that sort of that flat. I'm not sure what it's really meant for, but it's there on the desk when you pull it out above the drawers. I always call that the cat flap because it's actually where cats like to sit and watch. And if they get really sick of you, not giving them enough attention, then they'll get up and walk across the keyboard. But I haven't had a cat do that for quite a long time.
Yeah.
My kids used to be very, very, because I did used to put pages on the floor as I wrote them. My kids grew up being absolutely terrified of stepping on any paper.
Yeah.
And I remember when the Ballard kids, who were pretty wild, used to come over, and my kids would see them step on a piece of paper, not necessarily anything important, but step on a piece of paper, and they'd just look in horror. What's going to happen? The world would end if that happened.
Yeah.
Those are about the only rules I ever had with my kids: was don't step on the paper.
Yeah.
My daughter actually was ironing, and for some reason the manuscript of Warlord of the Air, I think it was Warlord of the Air, it might have been the Land Leviathan, the sequel, but anyway, it was on the end of the ironing board, or it may have been on a table and she was ironing because I never saw it happen. But she was putting the iron on top of the manuscript. And it was the only manuscript, the only copy of the manuscript, because I would Xerox it later, but that was it. And eventually, I was looking for the manuscript, to send it off, and Kate said, "I'm afraid it's gone, Dad." And I said, "Well," and it was like a cartoon. There was this manuscript with an iron-shaped hole all the way through it.
Oh, no.
So I had to rewrite it. I luckily rewrote it pretty quickly. But
you had to rewrite the entire manuscript?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first time.
It's a good job you're a fast typer then.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. I think it improves for a little bit. I always used to say that the books I wrote in 2 days, I wrote some books in 2 days, were that I needed the third day for the polish.
Right. Wow. So just briefly going back to what you were saying about your writing style as well, because of course, when you get into those longer form books, I think it was The Condition of Muzak won the Guardian Fiction Prize, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And then in the 80s, you're writing Mother London.
Yeah.
That was nominated for an award.
That was the Whitbread. It actually won the Whitbread.
Right.
Briefly. I was phoned up, and one of the judges who should not have really done this, but anyway, one of the judges who liked the book a lot phoned me and said, I can't hold it in. I just can't hold it in. You've won the Whitbread. And I said, oh, great. I didn't even know I was nominated.
Yeah.
And but I was pleased, because it means money. It's not an empty award. I mean, it gets you sales.
Yeah.
And then the next morning he rang me and he said, and he was furious. He said, "I'm afraid I shouldn't have called you because I think it was Faye Weldon. Faye Weldon changed her vote to Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses because she said that Salman would never forgive her if she didn't vote for Satanic Verses." Right. So for one or half a day, really, I won the Whitbread, but that was. But there were only 3 books in the short list. So it was mine, Rushdie's, and Bruce Chatwin was the other one. So it was a nice thing, but not to be.
No, I mean you were kind of breaking out of that perception of you with those books as well. Because in your introduction to Before Armageddon, you comment on the habit of critics to group authors by genre rather than by what the author is saying or expressing through their ideas and writing. How do you feel about how critics have approached your work over the last 60 plus years?
Well, it's been up and down. When I was first publishing, I was publishing in hardback, which meant that the first two, the first one, the short Stealer of Souls, didn't really get any attention at all. But the second one, Stormbringer, got a lot of attention and quite good reviews in the general press. I mean, single reviews. I was sort of surprised. And then the next books I did that were published in hardback were Behold the Man and The Final Program, which Alison and Busby did. And they got tremendous reviews. And I was essentially seen as a literary writer of imagination. And then the paperback people, because they didn't review paperbacks in those days much at all. So I was quite happy. I mean, I was publishing these books in hardback that people thought were good enough to review. And I was bringing out like the Hawkmoon books in paperback. And then the publishers discovered they could sell a lot of those books, the Hawkmoon books and so on, the fantasy genre books, in hardback. So they started putting them in hardback. Once that happened, I confused the critics. They didn't know what to make of me. I remember seeing a review of a Coram book in The Spectator by Peter Ackroyd, who later was very supportive of my later books, but he was the literary editor of The Spectator at the time, and the review was, I don't know what this rubbish is all about. And that was it. And later he would be doing big solus reviews in the Sunday Times and so on. So luckily it didn't prejudice him completely. But that was it. I mean, there was a tendency to think there was no category for fantasy for a start when I first started. They thought fantasy meant fairy stories and children's stories and Wind in the Willows, that sort of thing. And for some reason, neither Lord of the Rings nor Gormenghast were categorized. I mean, they were seen as singular things, not part of a genre, which they aren't really. I mean, I must say, well, they weren't when they were written. So they, at that point, on the first, I think it's the first or second Elric book, they've got SF in big letters because SF was selling all right. And then underneath that, in smaller letters, is fantasy, because they hadn't got any inroads. It wasn't until a year or two later, not much later, that people like Don Walheim and Larry Shaw in the States began to publish what Lynn Carter called adult fantasy. And then the Ballantine series started and all of that. That people accepted that fantasy could mean books for adults. So I mean, I was confusing them on most levels at the time. I mean, I didn't particularly mind because they seemed to, at least I could get an advance for the book. I mean, after that, I lost interest in it. I didn't really know there were such things as royalties in a way, because I wasn't. I mean, I knew there were, and I calculated there should be, but nonetheless, I didn't think in terms of royalties. I just thought in terms of the next book and what I could get for it. But so it was really not until the 80s, and I would say probably the 70s it would have been, wouldn't it? It was Gloriana and Condition of Muzak that got a lot of attention. And they started getting attention, in the literary press. So things were changing by then, by the 70s. Again, New Worlds helped produce that change.
Yeah.
Um, and people like Phil Dick, but I remember the guy at Cape, I can't remember, Tony Richardson, I think his name was, at Cape. Myself, John Brunner, and John Brunner actually persuaded him to start doing Philip
Yeah.
K. Dick books, and he found that those started to move the Ballard started to move the way people saw stuff as well, and new worlds, and so and there were a lot of journalists, and you talk about working class. Most of the journalists I knew had come out of the working class. I mean, they were ambitious boys in places like Hull, who got a job on the local paper and worked their way into Fleet Street.
Yeah.
So there were several, I mean, really quite a few top journalists. I mean, people with columns of their own, stuff like that, who were also behind me in backing the whole New Worlds thing. So that when we got banned by Smiths, for instance, they made a big fuss about it, and then gradually, it's by the 1980s, I would say probably certain writers anyway, a number of writers like Ballard and me and so on were and Aldous were beginning to be seen as serious writers.
Yeah.
Whatever that means. Yeah.
Yeah, because I suppose all that period coincides with your second run as editor of New World as well, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So do you think these things of, when it comes to fantasy and science fiction and critical acclaim and being considered literary, for want of a better expression, have things changed in that respect?
Yes, they have. You get a lot more respect than you used to get. I mean, if you, I remember at parties, both Jimmy Ballard and I used to say we were self-employed. No, not self-employed. We were what was the word? But people say, "What do you do?" And and I'd say, "Oh, I'm independently wealthy." That's what I would say, because it saved a lot of talk about flying saucers and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, a lot of science fiction fans have the same, exactly the same experience. Oh, you don't read that funny stuff, do you? And all that. By, I think it must have been by the 80s, people had started to understand that and I think it was sales as much as anything else. It usually, I mean, I may seem cynical, but I don't think I am particularly cynical. It usually comes down to commerce, and hard, hard realities, rather than people suddenly seeing the light or anything like that. Once Phil Dick and Jimmy Ballard and I and a few others started selling well, that begins to shift you into a different perspective. It's to do with money, really.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I don't think it's got much to do with Messiah, being a Messiah.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, it's when you think about, I mean, your impact on the zeitgeist or whatever you want to call it, and how these things work. Money or no money, sales or no sales, it's plain to see from hashtags in places like Instagram, and the visualizations of your work still carry a huge amount of cachet, and book covers from the 1960s that get hashtagged Michael Moorcock on Instagram attract hundreds and sometimes thousands of views. I mean, for me, from a very early age, the imagery of, as I've mentioned, for some of those book covers left an indelible mark on my imagination, not just because there was a picture of you looking like Grizzly Adams, and not just because I love the Bob Haberfield covers and the Jim Cawthorne illustrations, but how do you feel about the visual representations of your work over the years?
Well,
how much has that helped and got it across?
Oh, it's helped enormously. I think. I think that Bob Haberfield's covers and Michael Whelan's covers in the States, doing Elric and you know the covers, all the covers he did for Door books, really.
Buff Elric.
Helps sell the books a lot. There's no doubt that I mean, I always knew this as a working journalist, you know, because I was, you know, I'd been editing for quite a long time. The reason that I got the job on New Worlds from Carnell was because I had the experience of doing all that editing. I mean, it wasn't just because he saw, oh, you look like a bright lad, I'll make you the editor of New Worlds. You know, he just said, basically he was going to make me the editor of both magazines, but they gave the other one to Bonfiglione, which I'm glad of, because it would have killed me to have had to do two. Anyway, so and now I've lost my own drift, so I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Well, we're just talking about, you know, covers and representations of your
they make
work.
A lot of difference visually. I mean, the books and the covers in both cases, in slightly different ways, I must admit, attracted a lot of readers, and for some reason attracted a lot of musicians. So that, you know, a lot of those covers, certainly the Whelan covers in the States, have appeared on God knows how many heavy metal albums and other record albums. So it was the association between music and rock and roll. I mean, what I think of as good popular music, was mainly English. It was initially English. It was English musicians reading the books. I mean, almost everybody, as I said, you know, on the bus had one of my books for some. You know, Angela Carter used to say that she'd get jealous because every time she stepped into a train, everybody in the carriage was reading one of my books, and she'd really get pissed off with me. And so, you know, that was initially English and also French. It started happening in France about the same time too. I think there's a whole lot of things. It was money, and we could actually, you know, people could afford to buy albums as well as they could afford to buy books. There was more money about. It was bad times in that what appeared to be bad times, which were obviously not bad times in terms of the 30s, but when in fact a lot of fantasy magazines and science fiction magazines began to flourish. That was, you know, again. So if you've got it, you know, if things are looking economically a bit shaky, people tend to turn to Conan the Barbarian, as it were. I think it's pretty. It was pretty obvious to me that was what I was doing. That I was essentially writing for people who were worried about their jobs, and spending what little money they had frequently on my books, which I was always grateful for. I mean, I never. It's like with Hawkwind, we were always aware of our, you know, there but for the grace of God, as it were. We went. Here comes the boss.
Are we out of time? No, it's fine.
Pretty much, yeah. Have you had is it enough?
Yeah, it's lovely. Anything's enough.
We can do it again if you want to, you know, and do another one sometime. I'd be happy to. I mean, I like talking to you.
That would be absolutely. I don't know what. Maybe it's with the beard. I don't know.
Probably,
Friendly beard, probably.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. Well, you know what? It's been absolutely fantastic to talk to you. I hope you have a brilliant birthday. I wish you a very Merry Christmas, and I'll drop you a line in the new year.
Okay, the same to you and to your wife, of course, and I hope to see you again.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
A lot. Cheers.
It's episode 100, baby.
No. Can you believe you've got to it already?
Episode 100. And not only is it episode 100, but it's the 6th occasion we've recorded a birthday special to celebrate not only Mike's birthday, but of course your birthday.
Yes.
Which, as you're my wife, that should probably be the other way around. But you know what, let's go. Your birthday and Mike's birthday.
It's too late, you've said it now.
Oh, sorry. Well, happy birthday anyway.
Thank you very much.
And we have retired to our traditional repose. Well, actually, I said traditional. This time we're in Morecambe. And this is actually a recording of firsts on 2 levels. Because one is, I don't think we've ever actually recorded a podcast in Morecambe, even though we have done a Morecambe bookshop special, an all-pay bookshop special when we did The Winds of Gaff. Yeah. I think we actually recorded that when we got home.
I think you could be right, because the first time we ever recorded for my birthday was in Whitby.
Mm-hmm. It was, and that was 5 years ago.
Wow.
5 whole earth years ago, pre-COVID, 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, we recorded that, and you had a choice that time, and you chose a Robert E. Howard story. You wanted to read a Conan story. So we did The Tower of the Elephant. So this being episode 100, and also being your birthday, as I am entirely selfless in these matters, I said to you, what would you like to read for this episode 100 birthday special? And you said...
Robert E. Howard.
You wanted to revisit Robert E. Howard,
I did.
But something other than Conan.
Yes. We said at the time I really enjoyed doing it, and it would be good to come back to it. And we've talked about loads of different books, but it just felt the time was right to redo it. Yeah,
I think that's fair. And I think that first birthday special was only about our 4th or 5th episode.
Very early in, wasn't it?
Yeah, so 96 episodes. Now, obviously, Dave and I did do The Phoenix on the Sword not so long ago, so we did do a Conan story. I think we might have done 2 from memory. But anyway, we did revisit Conan, but this is the first time you've come back to Robert E. Howard. Now, we had a number of choices on that, and it was, did we do a Solomon Kane story? Because, of course, you've seen the Solomon Kane movie, so you know generally what Solomon Kane's all about.
And I love the movie, I have to say. I might be one of few, but I really did enjoy the movie.
We do enjoy that movie. For me, it's something of a guilty pleasure because I don't think it's a particularly great adaptation of Solomon Kane, because it tries to give Solomon Kane an origin story, which I don't think was necessary. Yeah. It's not based on any of the Solomon Kane stories. But you know what? Purefoy was a good Solomon Kane once it actually got cracking.
It was, and they gave Conan a story, a backstory as well, didn't they? So it's what they do.
Yeah.
And, these short stories, they have to bulk out films.
Well, I think there's enough Robert E. Howard stories that they don't have to do a Conan origin story. They can just do a Robert E. Howard story. But anyway, we'll just have to agree to differ on that one. Because we had 2 Conans. Well, we had 3 Conan films. Conan the Destroyer was really more of an adaptation of the Marvel comic than it was a Robert E. Howard story, but it was good fun in its own right. And then the Jason Momoa Conan film, they did another origin story.
Yeah.
Although it did have the Ron Perlman seal of quality. We've got to give it that. But yeah, no, that didn't work for me either. However, we decided on this occasion that we would talk about some Robert E. Howard stories, but it being almost Christmas, we thought, what the hell? We like our ghost stories for Christmas. We like our Christmas horror movies. So why not pursue a couple of Robert E. Howard spooky tales? So we've both got a copy of the Wordsworth edition, Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural, The Haunter of the Ring and Other Tales by Robert E. Howard. And there's a lot of stories in here, but we just picked, I picked.
You picked.
The Haunter of the Ring, which is the title story, and the rather unfortunately named Pigeons from Hell, which could be a better title, to be honest.
Yeah, I totally agree, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to it as to why I
We will.
agree it wasn't. There was a lot of better titles that could have been.
Yeah, Pigeons from Hell, not the greatest name
No.
for a spooky short story. No. Well, not in 1934 when it was written. Maybe it made perfect sense. I don't know. But by today's standards, it's a bit of a cheesy title.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a cheesy title. We've also got a drink. We've actually been to our traditional afternoon stopping point, Embargo, in Morecambe. You've had a couple of mulled wines.
Uh-huh.
I've had a couple of pints. Now we've got a couple of drinks laid out in front of us. You've got what you got? A Vino Tinto of some description.
So I've got a Trivento, which we had last week when we were away.
We did.
And it's a Malbec, and they've done a bottle specifically with Christmas that says Merry Malbec.
Oh, very apt. Very apt. And on that Christmas theme, I've got a Yorkshire Heart and the Chili Jam Man mashup called Mostly Ghostly, a rich, dark and warm chili beer, a tasty 5.4% with a 3 out of 10 on the temperature scale, which was a gift from Ian and Ange, who we saw just Friday, 2 days ago. And of course we saw Ian yesterday as well because, got over to the pint with Ian. So I'm going to give this a go anyway. And we've got a 3 out of 10 on the temperature scale, but let's give it a go. It's vegan friendly as well if anybody's interested. Cheers.
Cheers.
That is a very, very delicious brown ale with the ever so slightest kick of chilli in it. Yeah, I was expecting it to be horrific, but in actual fact, it's just got that peppery back taste at the back end of it. What does it say on the label? It says, when two great Yorkshire companies come together, we're in Morecambe, this is a Yorkshire thing. A rich dark ale infused with one of the world's hottest chilies, the Boot, or Naga, aka the Ghost Pepper, a lovely delayed heat coupled with a long and powerful satisfying finish. And yeah, the pepperiness is just starting to kick in at the back of that, but it's not off-putting. It's, not that I find chili off-putting, but I do find that I've had chili beers in the past that have been quite hard work. This one is just a nice, rich brown ale with a peppery kick.
And you do like a Naga chili.
I do. And as a backup, we've got a bottle of limoncello that we picked up on our way. Is it the A64 from the cheese
A65.
courtyard? A65. There's a wonderful place along the A65 called the Courtyard Cheesery and Wine Shop. And we went in the wine shop. She made us taste wine. We spent a small fortune because I think she saw us coming. But this is a Bepizzolini, proper Italian limoncello produced in Italy. 100% natural. What's the ingredients? Sugar syrup, alcohol, lemon peel infusion, natural flavours. All right, fair enough. It's going to be a bit on the sweet side, but hopefully it'll have a tang.
What percentage?
28.
Ooh, nice
Pop that. I'll pour us a bit of that. Let's have a look. Wee bit of limoncello. Now, of course, it's a while since we drank limoncello, but we have a recent history with limoncello, don't we?
Yes, when we went on the P&O ferry.
Yeah, so we went to Arnhem for the 80th anniversary commemorations of the Battle of Arnhem. And we spent a wonderful afternoon, sat on a balcony with a couple of my dad's comrades from back in the 1960s, the two Tonys.
The two Tonys.
And we drank a bottle of limoncello together while they regaled us with tales of what a bugger my dad was in the 1960s.
That was a fabulous afternoon.
Yeah, so let's try the limoncello.
Cheers, Tonys.
That's pretty good.
That is.
I think I'll put that aside for the time being, though, because actually, I was about to say, I don't think it really goes with the Mostly Ghostly beer, but actually they don't clash that badly. But I suspect it might clash a little bit with
the wine.
With your Vino Tinto.
That is really nice. The first hit is a bit sugary, but then that goes.
Yeah.
And it's alcohol and lemon.
Yeah, we better go steady on it though. We don't want to be in a coma before we even get into our book. Yes, so we've gone with The Haunter of the Ring as our first story. And I think what we'll find is these two stories are significantly different to each other. But let's have a quick read.
They are.
From the beginning of The Haunter of the Ring. As I entered John Kirawan's study, I was too much engrossed in my own thoughts to notice, at first, the haggard appearance of his visitor, a big, handsome young fellow well known to me. "Hello, Kirawan," I greeted. "Hello, Gordon. Haven't seen you for quite a while. How's Evelyn?" And before he could answer, still on the crest of the enthusiasm which had brought me there, I exclaimed, "Look here, you fellows. I've got something that will make you stare. I got it from that robber, Ahmed Mektub, and I paid high for it. But it's worth it. Look." From under my coat, I drew the jewel-hilted Afghan dagger which had fascinated me as a collector of rare weapons. Kirawan, familiar with my passion, showed only polite interest, but the effect on Gordon was shocking. With a strangled cry, he sprang up and backward, knocking the chair clattering to the floor. Fists clenched and countenance livid, he faced me, crying, "Keep back! Keep away from me, or—" I was frozen in my tracks. "What in the—" I began bewilderedly, when Gordon, with another amazing change of attitude, dropped into a chair and sank his head in his hands. I saw his heavy hands quiver. Sorry, I didn't see that at all. I saw his heavy shoulders quiver. I stared helplessly from him to Kirawan, who seemed equally dumbfounded. "Is he drunk?" I asked. Kirawan shook his head, and filling a brandy glass, offered it to the man. Gordon looked up with haggard eyes, seized the drink, and gulped it down like a man half famished. Then he straightened up and looked at us, shamefacedly. "I'm sorry I went off my handle, O'Donnell," he said. "It was the unexpected shock of you drawing that knife." "Well," I retorted with some disgust, "I suppose you thought I was going to stab you with it." "Yes, I did." Then, at the utterly blank expression on my face, he added, "Oh, I didn't actually think that. At least, I didn't reach that conclusion by any process of reasoning. It was just the blind, primitive instinct of a hunted man against whom anyone's hand may be turned." His strange words and the despairing way he said them sent a queer shiver of nameless apprehension down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I demanded uneasily. "Hunted? For what? You've never committed a crime in your life." "Not in this life, perhaps," he muttered. "What do you mean?" "What if retribution for a black crime committed in a previous life were hounding me?" he muttered. "That's nonsense," I snorted. "Oh, is it?" he exclaimed, stung. "Did you ever hear of my great-grandfather, Sir Richard Gordon of Argyll?" "Sorry, but what's that got to do with it? You've seen his portrait. Doesn't it resemble me?" "Well, yes," I admitted, "except that your expression is frank and wholesome, where his is crafty and cruel." "He murdered his wife," answered Gordon. "Suppose the theory of reincarnation were true. Why shouldn't a man suffer in one life for a crime committed in another?" "You mean you think you are the reincarnation of your great-grandfather?" "Of all the fantastic! Well, since he killed his wife, I suppose you'll be expecting Evelyn to murder you." This last was delivered in searing sarcasm, as I thought of the sweet, gentle girl Gordon had married. His answer stunned me. "My wife," he said slowly, "has tried to kill me 3 times in the past week." Good Lord.
Oh.
And there is our setup. A slightly hysterical setup. In all honesty. So it's all very heightened and all very hysterical. So what do you make of that as a setup for a story?
It's a great setup, and it's like, oh, where are we going to go here?
Yeah.
What's occurring?
Yeah, what is occurring? And why is everybody speaking in such a heightened, over-the-top fashion? It's kind of cool, though. I do enjoy it.
Oh, it's really funny. It's like when he produces the dagger, and I was like, would you have it under your coat? And look at this.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this, when it's from the point of view of a narrator, is this is 90% Robert E. Howard, isn't it? Robert E. Howard definitely would carry an Afghan dagger under his waistcoat and pull it out in front of his friend and go, "Check this out."
I mean, from watching the movie with Vincent D'Onofrio and, was it?
Renée Zellweger.
Renée Zellweger. When I read this now, I do it how he did in the film, because he goes through, he does it whilst he's writing.
Yeah.
He gets into the parts.
Yeah.
And I can't help but, I find that very endearing, but I feel to appreciate it as he did. I don't know how much based on truth it is.
Yeah.
And I know it's written from letters in it between them. Yeah. I just think, I love it.
Yeah. We mentioned this briefly when I spoke with Dave, but of course it was you and I who watched The Whole Wide World.
Yes, that's it.
With D'Onofrio as Robert E. Howard and Zellweger as Novaline Price. But I really, really like that film.
Yes.
I like it a lot. It's based on Novaline Price's books and her recollections of Howard, which were first-hand recollections. I think D'Onofrio is fucking brilliant.
Yes, he
is. As Robert E. Howard. And it really does portray him as super, super intense, but quite a sad character. And I think that really comes through strongly in this story as well, for a couple of reasons, which we'll get into. But we've got our setup. And you're right, I read Robert E. Howard completely differently after watching that film. I watched it about 20 plus years ago. Me and Yaki watched it.
Yeah.
And we were both really into it because that was sold in a way as like a melancholic romance movie. And if you're a Robert E. Howard fan, I think it's a terrific book, terrific film and a very good book, yeah.
I think that the cover is not a good one.
No.
At all.
I think they were trying to sell it to a specific crowd. Like the romantic, weepy
like a love
crowd.
story,
Yeah. But anyway, we need to take Gordon at his word, don't we? He's a little bit hysterical, but he explains to Kirawan. Kirawan turns out to be quite an intriguing character, I think, as we'll find. And the narrator, that his first experience of realising that something's wrong is they're at top of a hill, up a big escarpment, and he gets a shove in the back and finds himself rolling down the hill when they were up there picking wildflowers. Like a romantic afternoon picking wildflowers. And he got shoved down the hill.
Yeah, but rather than say, what have you done that for?
Yeah.
You would have thought he would picked up on the fact she said, what happened?
Yeah.
That was the little clue that things were as he thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think he gets even more troubled when she tries to run him over on the lawn in a car, but crashes into a tree instead. Which is, yeah.
But to be fair, I mean, I have to remember it was written of a time.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when he wrote this, but...
34.
Yeah, and I had to think of that when after the first one, and he was like, there was no evidence of her having psychological weaknesses or nerves. And it's just like, oh, here we go.
Yeah, there are a couple of really choice passages about them. The usual hysteria of women, I think is one of them, isn't it?
Well, they keep referring to her as a girl, but she's his wife.
Yeah.
And they talk about her being wholesome and natural. And I was like, would you use this in the 21st century, calling somebody wholesome?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's less problematic than the couple of paragraphs where they go, yeah, there's the usual hysterical behaviour of women, which is quite amusing. But she's got no memory of these attempts, and there's a brilliant bit where Gordon muses on whether these just may be impulses.
Yeah, can I just say on this bit before you go on, that he spoke about impulses and talked about how most people have an impulse. You might have a knife or a gun in your hand and think, what would happen if I just shot my friend?
This is 100% Robert E. Howard talking.
And in my head, I thought when we come back to it, would be, I'd watch him. He was my friend.
Yeah. It says... So this is Gordon talking, but, I think this is a little bit of Robert E. Howard coming out. It says, I began to think she was subject to crazy impulses. Most of us felt the impulse to leap from tall buildings, and sometimes a person feels a blind, childish, and utterly reasonless urge to harm someone. We pick up a pistol, and the thought suddenly enters our mind how easy it would be to send our friend who sits smiling and aware into eternity with a touch of the trigger. Of course we don't do it, but the impulse is there. So I thought perhaps some lack of mental discipline made evil and susceptible to these unguided impulses and unable to control them. Nonsense, the narrator breaks in. I've known her since she was a baby. If she had any such trait, she developed it since she married you. It was an unfortunate remark. Gordon caught it up with a despairing gleam in his eye. That's just it. Since she married me, it's a curse, a black, ghastly curse crawling like a serpent out of the past. I tell you, I was Richard Gordon, and she was Lady Elizabeth, his murdered wife. His voice sank to a blood-freezing whisper. I shuddered. It is an awful thing to look upon the ruin of a keen, clear brain, and such I was certain that I surveyed in James Gordon. Why or how, or by what grisly chance it had come about, I could not say, but I was certain the man was mad. You spoke of 3 attempts. It was John Kirawan's voice again, calm and stable amid the gathering webs of horror and unreality. Look here, Gordon lifted his arm, drew back the sleeve and displayed a bandage, the cryptic significance of which was intolerable. I came into the bathroom this morning looking for my razor. I found Evelyn just on the point of using my best shaving implement for some feminine purpose, to cut out a pattern or something. Like many women, she can't seem to realise the difference between a razor and a butcher knife or a pair of shears.
Yes, I might have put that one to memory. Feminine purposes. And I was like, oh, so not to shave her arms and legs. Oh, no. to cut
To
material.
cut a pattern, yeah.
To make something for the house.
Oh, it's amazing. I was a bit irritated and I said, Evelyn, how many times have I told you not to use my razors for such things? Bring it here. I'll give you my pocket knife. I'm sorry, Jim, she said. I didn't know it would hurt the razor. Here it is. She was advancing, holding the open razor toward me. I reached for it. Then something warned me. It was the same look in her eyes, just as I had seen the day before. She nearly ran me over. That was all that saved my life, for I instinctively threw up my hand just as she slashed at my throat with all her power. The blade gashed at my arm, like you see, before I caught her wrist. For an instant, she fought me like a wild thing. Her slender body was taut as steel beneath my hands. Then she went limp, and the look in her eyes was replaced by a strange, dazed expression. The razor slipped out of her fingers. I let go of her, and she stood swaying as if about to faint. I went to the lavatory. My wound was bleeding in a beastly fashion. The next thing I heard her cry out, and she was hovering over me. Jim, she cried, how did you cut yourself so terribly? It's so wonderful. I love the way that poor Jim Gordon is describing all this in the most artificially constructed narrative style. I think it's potentially one of Robert E. Howard's weaknesses. He's great at writing action. He's good at writing mood. He's good at writing imagery. All of this dialogue back and forth is ever so slightly cheesy.
But it was good. Well, not for Jim's point of view. When she tried to run him over, at least he was letting her drive the car.
Good point. Good point. A point which had never even occurred to me.
Although I thought there was going to be some comment about the fact she ran into a tree.
Oh, well, yeah.
But she was dazed and has no recollection.
No, that's true. Nobody passed comment about, Jim, why did you let a woman drive your car?
Yeah, that's a bonus. That's
fairly progressive,
Robert,
isn't it? Yeah. But anyway, Gordon is convinced that Evelyn is possessed by the vengeance of that ancestor of his. But Kirawan, this interesting character of Kirawan, isn't convinced and thinks there may be more to it. And it turns out he's right because, apparently, before they got married, there was another suitor on the scene who courted Evelyn but lost out to Gordon, a guy called Joseph Wyrmwalk. He sounds dodgy. But why? Why does he sound dodgy?
Because he's got Latin blood. Of course.
That's exactly right. That is exactly
And then
right.
they have a discussion and it might not be Latin.
Yeah.
Are you reading?
Yeah, I'm going to read this bit. So the narrator knows this Joseph Wyrmwalk. It says, though I counted the man as my best friend, he was his best friend, I knew but little of his past. He had come into my life as abruptly and as unannounced as Joseph Wyrmwalk had come into the life of Evelyn Ash. I had met him at the Wanderers Club, which is composed of the drift of the world, travellers, eccentrics, and all manner of men whose paths lie outside the beaten tracks of life. I had been attracted to him and intrigued by his strange powers and deep knowledge. I vaguely knew that he was the black sheep younger son of a titled Irish family, that he had walked many strange ways. Gordon's mention of Hungary struck a chord in my memory. One phase of his life Kirawan had once let drop fragmentarily. I only knew he had once suffered a bitter grief and savage wrong, and that it had been in Hungary, but the nature of the episode I did not know. Now, of course, sorry, we're talking about Kirawan there. So he's talking about Kirawan, his friend, so we get a little bit of background on this mysterious Kirawan guy.
But it is little. It leaves you asking a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And also, you class him as your best friend, but you know very little about him.
Yeah.
Is that you don't feel able to ask more? But it's interesting.
Yeah. You know what, it's all quite sad and melancholy in this in a way when you think about it, because it all feels like a longing dream of sorts from Howard, like a personal fantasy that he's got this circle of friends that include people like Kirawan, He loved the historical, he loved the macabre and the mysterious. He longed for like-minded souls that he could have these kind of conversations with. So you've got this story where they've got this idea where he's got this circle of friends where they compare mysterious ancient Afghan daggers, and he has friends who've pursued weird occult things in Hungary and all this type of stuff. And you get the idea that he would have loved to spend time pondering the mysteries of the world with people like this, rather than being tied down in that dusty small-town world of Cross Plains, living with his ailing mother and his doctor father. And he just wanted to burst out of it when he's writing his Conan stories, and you can sense that in the Conan stories. But I think in this, it's amplified tenfold with stories like this. That you get that sense that he would love to be living this life.
But I had a feeling that's why he got on so well with Evelyn, and he was able to talk because she was wanting to be a writer as well.
Yeah.
But there was obviously the sticking block was she was a woman in the 1930s.
Oh, Novaline, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Novaline. Yeah, Evelyn is the possessed woman who's trying to kill her husband. Sorry. Yeah, Novaline Price, yeah. Yeah.
And that's really sad, because he didn't know how to be around her.
No.
Because the only woman role model he has was his mum, she had her own problems. From what we saw, obviously I don't know the depths.
Yeah, that's very true. There is a suggestion that Joseph Rollock, is described as an elegant sophisticate, this Joseph Rollock guy, a young exquisite who came into Evelyn's life and nearly rushed her off her feet for a while, but in the end she came back to her first love, Gordon. Rollock took it pretty hard. For all his suaveness, there's a streak of violence and passion in the man that might have cropped out, but not for his infernal indolence and blasé indifference. Oh, there's nothing to be said against Rollock, interrupted Gordon impatiently. He must know that Evelyn never really loved him. He merely fascinated her temporarily with his romantic Latin air. Not exactly Latin, Jim, I protested. Rollock does look foreign, but it isn't Latin. It's almost Oriental. Oh, he's a foreign-looking bugger.
And if it's not Latin, it's Asian.
Yes, that's right. So meanwhile, Evelyn is seeking the counsel of her old family friends, Dr. Donnelly and uncle, in inverted commas, Bill Bain. Old family friends. And they aren't impressed with young Gordon's accusations. Uncle Bill gets a bit rough.
He does.
He says, "You blighter." Tries to rough him up. But things rapidly go pear-shaped when Evelyn talks of her dreams. Oh. Of what have you dreamed, Mrs. Gordon? Asked Kirawan gently. She pressed her hands to her temples and stared dully at him, as if only half comprehending.
A black thing, she muttered. A horrible, faceless black thing that mews and mumbles and paws over me with apish hands. I dream of it every night, and in the daytime I try to kill the only man I ever loved. I'm going mad. Maybe I'm already crazy and don't know it.
Calm yourself, honey. To Dr. Donnelly, with all his signs, it was only another case of feminine hysteria. His matter-of-fact voice seemed to soothe her, and she sighed and drew a weary hand through her damp locks. We'll talk this all over, and everything's going to be okay, he said, drawing a thick cigar from his vest pocket. Give me a match, honey. She began mechanically to feel about the table, and just as mechanically, Gordon said, There are matches in the drawer, Evelyn. She opened the drawer and began groping in it, when suddenly, as if struck by recollection and intuition, Gordon sprang up, white-faced, and shouted, No, don't open that drawer, don't! Even as he voiced that urgent cry, she stiffened, as if at the feel of something in the drawer. Her change of expression held us all frozen. Even Kirawan. The vital intelligence vanished from her eyes like a blown-out flame, and into them came the look Gordon has described as blank. The term was descriptive. Her beautiful eyes were dark wells of emptiness, as if the soul had been withdrawn from behind them. Her hand came out of the drawer holding a pistol, and she fired point-blank. Gordon reeled with a groan and went down, blood starting from his head. For a flashing instant she looked down stupidly at the smoking gun in her hand, like one suddenly waking from a nightmare. Then her wild scream of agony smote our ears.
Oh, God, I've killed him! Jim!
She reached him before any of us, throwing herself on her knees and cradling his bloody head in her arms, while she sobbed in an unbearable passion of horror and anguish. The emptiness was gone from her eyes. They were alive and dilated with grief and terror. I was making towards my prostrate friend with Donnelly and Bain, but Kirawan caught my arm. His face was no longer immobile. His eyes glittered with a controlled savagery. Leave him to them, he snarled. We are hunters, not healers. Lead me to the house of Joseph Rollock. Oh, poor Jim Gordon.
But, reading it out like we just have, I could see Robert E. Howard doing this.
What doing it at his typewriter?
Yeah. And doing the different voices as well.
Yeah.
And, it does make me look at it so differently.
Yeah. The dude gets to Rollock's house, and in a weird twist, it turns out Kirawan and Rollock are old adversaries, steeped in the occult.
Well, they were friends. They hung around together until one went Rollock. Although he's not called Rollock, is he? He's Yosef.
Yosef Orlock or something. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. There's a really, really nice description of Rollock. Rollock, in a dressing gown of Chinese silk worked with dragons, was lounging on a divan, puffing quickly at a cigarette. He sat up, overturning a wine glass which stood with a half-filled bottle at his elbow. Before Kirawan could speak, I burst out with our news. James Gordon has been shot! He sprang to his feet. Shot when? When did she kill him? She? I glared in bewilderment. How did you know? And there's this wonderful paragraph. It says, with a steely hand, Kirawan thrust me aside, and as the men faced each other, I saw recognition flare up in Rolock's face. They made a strong contrast. Kirawan, tall, pale, with some white-hot passion. Rolock, slim, darkly handsome, with the Saracenic arch of his slim brows above his black eyes. I realised that whatever else occurred, it lay between these two men. They were not strangers. I could sense, like a tangible thing, the hate that lay between them. Oh, yeah, that's good stuff. And actually, weirdly homoerotic.
You're right, they were acquaintances rather than friends.
Yeah, it's strangely homoerotic. But Kirawan has totally got his number. And it turns out that this is written in 1934, The Phoenix and the Sword. Kirawan snarled, liar as always. What did you say just now when O'Donnell told you Gordon had been shot? When did she kill him? You were expecting to hear that the girl had killed her husband. Your psychic powers had told you that a climax was close at hand. You were nervously awaiting news of the success of your devilish scheme. But I did not need a slip of your tongue to recognise your handiwork. I knew as soon as I saw the ring on Evelyn Gordon's finger, the ring she could not remove, the ancient and accursed ring of Thothamon, handed down by foul cults of sorcerers since the days of forgotten Stygia. I knew that ring was yours, and I knew by what ghastly rights you came to possess it, and I knew its power. Once you put it on a finger in her innocence and ignorance, she was in your power. By your black magic, you summoned the black elemental spirit, the haunter of the ring, out of the gulfs of night and the ages. Here in your accursed chamber, you performed unspeakable rituals to drive Evelyn Gordon's soul from her body, and to cause that body to be possessed by that godless sprite from outside the human universe. Yes. So it's Josef Wyrmwalk. Josef Wyrmwalk, a guy who Kirawan came across in Hungary and has previous experience of him doing something similar and costing the life of a young woman.
Well, he degraded and debauched the one woman he loved.
He did. Kirawan's got history with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Kirawan's voice rose to a feline screech.
What was the price demanded by the fiend you drew from the pits? Ha! You blench. Josef Wyrmwalk is not the only man to have learned forbidden secrets. After I left Hungary, a broken man, I took up again the study of the black arts to trap you, you cringing serpent. I explored the ruins of Zimbabwe, the lost mountains of Inner Mongolia, and the forgotten jungle islands of the southern seas. I learnt what sickened my soul, so that I forswore occultism forever. But I learned of the black spirit that deals death by the hand of a beloved one and is controlled by a master of magic. But, Josef Wyrmwalk, you are not an adept. You have not the power to control the fiend you have invoked, and you have sold your soul.
The Hungarian tore at his collar as if it were a strangling noose. His face had changed as if a mask had dropped away. He looked much older. You lie, he panted. I did not promise him my soul.
I do not lie. Kirawan's shriek was shocking in its wild exultation. I know the price a man must pay for calling forth the nameless shape that roams the gulfs of darkness. Look, there in the corner behind you. A nameless, sightless thing is laughing, is mocking you. It has fulfilled its bargain, and it has come for you, Josef Wyrmwalk.
No, no, shrieked Wyrmwalk, tearing his limp collar away from his sweating throat. His composure had crumbled, and his demoralisation was sickening to see. I tell you, it was not my soul. I promised it a soul, but not my soul. He must take the soul of the girl, or of James Gordon.
Fool, roared Kirawan. Do you think he could take the souls of innocents? That he would not know that they were beyond his reach? The girl and the youth he could kill? Their souls were not his to take, or yours to give, but your black soul is not beyond his reach, and he will have his wage. Look! He's materialising behind you. He is growing out of thin air.
Was it the hypnosis inspired by Kirawan's burning words that caused me to shudder and grow cold? To feel an icy chill that was not of earth pervade the room? Was it a trick of light and shadow that seemed to produce the effect of a black anthropomorphic shadow on the wall behind the Hungarian? No, by heaven! It grew, it swelled. Wyrmwalk had not turned. He stared at Kirawan with eyes starting from his head, hair standing stiffly on his scalp, sweat dripping from his livid face. Kirawan's cry started shudders down my spine.
Look behind you, fool. I see him. He has come. He is here. His grisly mouth gapes in awful laughter. His misshapen paws reach for you.
And then at last Wyrmwalk wheeled, with an awful shriek, throwing his arms above his head in a gesture of wild despair, and for one brain-shattering instant he was blotted out by a great black shadow. Kirawan grasped my arm and we fled from that accursed chamber, blind with horror. The same paper, which bore a brief item telling of James Gordon having suffered a slight scalp wound by the accidental discharge of a pistol in his home, headlined the sudden death of Joseph Wyrmwalk, wealthy and eccentric clubman, in his sumptuous apartments, apparently from heart failure. Oh, I think that's quite a decent story.
I do, and I think why it endeared me as well is Kirawan and O'Donnell made me think of Sherlock and Watson.
I'm not sure that he actually wrote any of the stories about Kirawan, but I wish he had, because he's got the setup of a nice, kind of mysterious investigator pair.
And it's just that quietness of a very intelligent man and having his chin on his hands just made me think of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like he was ripping him off.
Yeah.
I saw a similarity that I liked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, Robert E. Howard wrote shitloads of different types of stories. He wrote Two Gun Pulp. He wrote stuff about sailors. He wrote stuff about westerns. He wrote stuff about, Arabic princes. Anything that was adventure novel, he wrote. And I like the idea of him writing, short detective tales where a mystery is solved. Yeah, it's pretty good. And, I like the fact that he ties this story also into his myth cycle around Hyboria and Conan as well, because Thothamon is in The Phoenix and the Sword, is a villainous sorcerer. He was only really a passing villain in the Robert E. Howard originals. But all the expanded lore via novels and comics written by other people, Thothamon is basically Conan's arch enemy. But he never was in the Robert E. Howard stories. He was a villain in one story, and he was really just mentioned in passing in two other stories. But this is very, very much Robert E. Howard tying that stuff in, that those dark powers lurking in the corner of the world are enough to cause terror to those who dabble and lose control. Because the great thing about magic and the supernatural and the occult in this Conan stories, it's not like most fantasy where you have wizards who cast spells and they're good. They can be good or bad. In Conan, magic is dangerous, demons are dangerous, and if you don't keep on top of things and you dabble with them, you're probably going to come a cropper.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens to Wyrmwalk. And it's also about perception and not truth, which holds power over men, because the moment Wyrmwalk has the perception that his plot has failed, this thing takes him and he just dies of a heart attack. There's no evidence that he's actually killed by whatever it is that he wanted to possess evil in. It's all left kind of a little bit up in the air as to exactly what happened, but dark powers were involved, but it's not like they killed him directly. It's just even having that involvement with those powers and those forces is really, really fucking dangerous.
But how we got to Joseph as well was it O'Donnell was asking, have you any enemies? So it's like proper communication between three.
Yeah.
And then Jim mentioning that Joseph had sent a ring and everything was fine.
Oh, that's right. He sends evil in the ring as a parting gift, like a no hard feelings gift. But it turns out to be like three serpents bound together in the shape of a ring that was the ring of Thothamon, the Stygian sorcerer from the days of Hyboria.
And she'd said when the doctor and her uncle had turned up that she'd been trying to get it off.
Yeah.
So, I liked all the different elements of the story.
It's good stuff. It's good stuff. And the second story that we read was Pigeons from Hell. A very, very different proposition, I think, but nonetheless very enjoyable. So written in 1934, but not published until 1938 after Robert E. Howard's death. So it's got no hysterical. Well, it's got one semi-hysterical man in it, but no hugely hysterical conversations and debates. But it's much more steady, much more doom heavy, rich in flavour, less dialogue heavy in the first half. All about mood and imagery, as a couple of travellers in the 1930s seek overnight rest in an old abandoned plantation manor in the south. And it's a violent haunted house scenario that plays out
wonder why he didn't get it published before his death.
He wrote tons of stories that weren't published during his lifetime. He was such a prolific writer. And some stories he submitted to editors and they said, no, we don't like this one. Maybe it was because it was more of a direct horror story. I don't know, but it was never published during his lifetime.
Right.
A couple of years after his death. But, I think another really, really strong, moody, evocative horror story. I thought it was great.
Yeah, it's a bit longer and it has its moments again, but again, it's 1934.
Yeah.
But, yeah, a really good horror story.
Yeah. So these two guys rest in this house. A scenario plays out that leaves one to suffer a hideous death and leave the other one deeply traumatised and at risk of copping the blame, but for a robust and perceptive local lawman. Another interesting character that I would have read more stories about, this lawman in the Deep South. Antebellum Deep South. Yeah, it's good stuff. So let's just have a quick read of some of the setup for this. Griswold awoke suddenly, every nerve tingling with a premonition of imminent peril. He stared about wildly, unable at first to remember where he was or what he was doing there. Moonlight filtered in through the dusty windows, and the great empty room from its lofty ceiling and gaping black fireplace was spectral and unfamiliar. Then, as he emerged from the clinging cobwebs of his recent sleep, he remembered where he was and how he came to be there. He twisted his head and stared at his companion sleeping on the floor near him. John Branner was but a vaguely bulking shape in the darkness that the moon scarcely grayed. Griswold tried to remember what had awakened him. There was no sound in the house, no sound outside except the mournful hoot of an owl far away in the piney woods. Now he had captured the elusive memory, it was a dream, a nightmare so filled with dim terror that it had frightened him awake. Recollection flooded back, vividly etching the abominable vision. Or was it a dream? Certainly it must have been, but it had blended so curiously with recent actual events that it was difficult to know where reality left off and fantasy began. So he's having this dream where he's seeing him and his mate John Branner, two men from New England, which of course is, the far eastern coast of the USA, in search of vacation pleasure. And they sight this house and they're sick and tired of bumping and pounding all day over roads in their car. So they decide to take a rest in this place, but things go slightly pear-shaped. He was lying in his blankets, staring tensely through the dim door and across the shadowy hall to where a beam of moonlight fell across the balustraded stairs some 7 steps up from the landing. And there was something on the stair, a bent, misshapen, shadowy thing that never moved fully into the beam of light, but a dim yellow blur that might have been a face was turned towards him, as if something crouched on the stair, regarding him and his companion. Fright crept chilly through his veins, and it was then that he awoke, if indeed he had been asleep. He blinked his eyes. The beam of moonlight fell across the stair just as he had dreamed it did, but no figure lurked there. Yet his flesh still crawled from the fear the dream or vision had roused in him. His legs felt as if they had been plunged into ice water. He made an involuntary movement to awaken his companion when a sudden sound paralysed him. It was the sound of whistling on the floor above. Eerie and sweet it rose, not carrying any tune, but piping shrill and melodious. Such a sound in a supposedly deserted house was alarming enough, but it was more than the fear of a physical invader that held Griswold frozen. He could not himself have defined the horror that gripped him, but Branner's blankets rustled, and Griswold saw he was sitting upright. His figure bulked dimly in the soft darkness, the head turned toward the stair as if the man were listening intently. More sweetly and more subtly evil rose that weird whistling. Anyway, Branner goes upstairs. Griswold follows him and sees Branner at the top of the stairs with his head hideously hacked and his brains leaking down his head, but he's stood there with a hatchet and he comes down the stairs towards Griswold. It's all pretty terrifying.
But he couldn't move or call out before his friend is drawn upstairs, so it's like... It reminds me of the Pied Piper.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, there's a Pied Piper kind of thing going on where this whistling will cause you to be struck with fear and paralysis.
And I did wonder if it was because his friend was asleep, because he had been woken by his nightmare.
Yeah, but it's pretty horrific, and this guy walks down the steps towards him and tries to kill him, and he runs away. Well, terrified.
He hits with the hatchet the place where his head had been 5 minutes earlier.
Yeah.
Had he not got up to follow his friend, he would also be dead.
Yeah. But he runs out into the night and comes across a man on horseback.
Well, he'd already tried to get in the car, hadn't he? And there was a serpent.
There's a snake on the car seat, so he has to run away from the car.
And someone's following him.
And he comes across the local sheriff, as it turns out, who was on his way back from taking a prisoner to town. This sheriff guy fires a shot at something that bolts off into the woods that may have been a dog or a wolf, and he takes Griswold back to the house because Griswold tells him this grisly story of his friend being brutally killed, only to find that his friend, Branner, is laid in the room where their sleeping gear was, dead, with the hatchet in his hand, but his own brains all over the hatchet. So it looks like he's been set up, and Griswold is actually, potentially, the murderer.
But at no point did he think about this. He was that traumatised by his best childhood friend being killed in unforeseen circumstances and being able to walk when he should have been dead, dropped where he was attacked.
Yeah. Fortunately, Buckner, the sheriff, is a keen and perceptive lawman. We've got our setup anyway, so we've got this lawman who's got Griswold, we've got his murdered friend. The lawman suspects that Griswold may well have been the killer. There's something unusual afoot, but he also acknowledges that there's some kind of mystery here, because why would Griswold pose his friend with the hatchet in his hand, with Branner's own brains on the hatchet, yet still tell a tale, not of self-defence, not of Branner trying to kill him, but tell this weird tale?
Because there were strangers there, wouldn't he just get in the car and drive off?
Yeah. Nothing seems to hang together correctly for Bruckner. So Bruckner is prepared to actually go back to the house with him and say, you know what, there's something strangely afoot here. However, when he goes upstairs, he gets the shit scared out of him as well, because his torch, his electric torch starts to go out, and he gets the sense that there's a presence up there. So Bruckner is pretty fucking smart, because he says, you know what, I'm not into this. This is really terrifying.
But also, he's like, these are brand new batteries. He's a very sensible but intelligent lawman with a good sense of his gut.
And a good sense of his own self-preservation as well, because he realises something's fucking not quite right here. So that's really cool. It's a really good setup. And then we get a little bit of exposition that this was a plantation, a cruel family of slave owners, the head of which was Miss Celia, who was brutally cruel to the slaves, and when the slaves were freed, she continued to be brutally cruel to a tormented mulatto servant. Mulatto meaning mixed race, effectively. Mulatto has different meanings amongst different ethnic communities in the USA, but in this respect, it means an individual who was of mixed African and European ancestry.
Is it worth mentioning at this point as well, and I think we'll come back to it later, that just before this, that Griswold had mentioned seeing all the pigeons take flight? Yeah,
it's called Pigeons from Hell, isn't it? Yeah. And Bruckner does mention that a local vagrant, a tramp, had a horrific tale about this place and he'd seen pigeons, but Bruckner himself has never seen pigeons.
No.
So these pigeons are some kind of harbingers of scary shit. Yeah. So we've got this cruel Miss Celia who had 4 daughters, and the last daughter, we find, ran away to California when all of the rest of the daughters vanished, and Miss Celia herself had vanished. So Bruckner takes him back to town, says, you know what, just keep your trap shut. I think there's something weird going on here, but it's going to be really, really hard for me to sell this to the local judge. But we need to come back here and investigate this, but we'll do it in daylight. So they return via a visit first to an ancient and wise black man.
I do struggle with some of this, but...
Yeah, undoubtedly, this is, from a modern perspective, slightly problematic, because what you've always got with Robert E. Howard is a slant of that fear of the dark continent and the Orientalism that people like Robert E. Howard, they have this reason to fear and stigmatise Asians and Africans. There's probably a different way of saying Orientalism might not be the right phrase in this case. There might be one that specifically addresses this kind of fear and stereotyping of African and West Indian superstition. And it's there, but, you know, it's there in all of his work, unfortunately. But there's this really, really nice paragraph where Bruckner says, "There's an old Negro that lives off this way a few miles. I want to talk to him. This old man is nearly 100 years old. They say he's a voodoo man." Griswold shivered at the phrase, staring uneasily at the green forest walls that shut them in. The scent of the pines was mingled with the odours of unfamiliar plants and blossoms. But underlying all was a reek of rot and decay. Again, a sick abhorrence of these dark, mysterious woodlands almost overpowered him. Voodoo, he muttered. I'd forgotten about that. I never could think of black magic in connection with the South. To me, witchcraft was always associated with old crooked streets in waterfront towns, overhung by gabled roofs that were old when there were hanging witches in Salem. Dark musty alleys where black cats and other things might steal at night. Witchcraft always meant the old towns of New England, to me. But all this is more terrible than any New England legend. These sombre pines, old deserted houses, lost plantations, old tales of madness and horror. God, what frightful ancient terrors there are in this continent fools call young. Ooh, that's a great paragraph. It's really lovely and evocative of that kind of horror, that deep south horror of places where genuinely horrific and terrible things took place and, unimaginable cruelty. And it's all there in these old ruined plantation houses, and land that's going to seed. It's great stuff. But the old man might be a bit puzzled, but he has a very, very, very long memory. And he tells them a tale of how not only West Indian voodoo magic could create zombies, but it could create the Zuvembe. Oh, the Zuvembe, which is not anything I've ever heard of before until I read this story.
Oh, I thought it was just me. Because obviously they mention zombies, but it's totally different.
Yeah.
Jacob, he said bluntly, it's time for you to talk. I know you know the secret of Blassonville Manor. I've never questioned you about it because it wasn't in my line. But a man was murdered there last night, and this man here may hang for it unless you tell me what haunts the old house of the Blassonvilles.
The old man's eyes gleamed, then grew misty as if clouds of extreme age drifted across his brittle mind. The Blassonvilles, he murmured, and his voice was mellow and rich, his speech not the patois of the piney woods. They were proud people, sirs, proud and cruel. Some died in the war, some were killed in duels. The menfolks, sirs, some died in the manor, the old manor. His voice trailed off into unintelligible mumblings.
What of the manor?
Miss Celia was the proudest of them all, the old man muttered. The proudest and the cruelest. The black people hated her. Joan most of all. Joan had white blood in her, and she was proud too. Miss Celia whipped her like a slave.
What is the secret of Blassonville Manor? Persisted Buckner.
What secret, sir? I do not understand.
Yes, you do. For years that old house has stood there with its mystery. You know the key to its riddle.
The old man stared the stew. He seemed perfectly rational now. Sir, life is sweet, even to an old man.
You mean somebody would kill you if you told me?
The old man was mumbling again, his eyes clouded. Not somebody. No human being. The gods of the swamps. My secret is inviolate, guarded by the big serpent, the god above all gods. He would send a little brother to kiss me with his cold lips, a little brother with a white crescent moon on his head. I sold my soul to the big serpent when he made me maker of Zuvembes.
Buckner stiffened. I heard that word once before, he said softly, from the lips of a dying man when I was a child. What does it mean?
Fear filled the eyes of old Jacob. What have I said? No, I said nothing.
Zuvembes, prompted Buckner.
Zuvembes, mechanically repeated the old man, his eyes vacant. A Zuvembe was once a woman. On the slave coast they know of them. The drums that whisper by night in the hills of Haiti tell of them. The makers of Zuvembes are honoured by the people of Dambala. It is death to speak of it. It was one of the snake god's forbidden secrets.
You speak of the Zuvembes.
I must not speak of it, mumbled the old man, and Griswold realised that he was thinking aloud, too far gone in his dotage to be aware that he was speaking at all. No man must know that I danced in the black ceremony of the voodoo and was a maker of zombies and Zuvembes. The big snake punishes loose tongues with death.
A Zuvembe is a woman?
Was a woman. She knew I was a maker of Zuvembes. She came and stood in my hut and asked for the awful brew, the brew of ground snake bones and the blood of vampire bats, and the dew from a nighthawk's wings, and other elements unnameable. She had danced in the black ceremony. She was ripe to become a Zuvembe. The black brew was all that was needed. The other was beautiful. I could not refuse her.
Who? Demanded Buckner tensely, but the old man's head was sunk on his withered breast, and he did not reply. He seemed to slumber as he sat. Buckner shook him. You gave a brew to make a woman a Zuvembe. What is a Zuvembe?
The old man stared resentfully and muttered drowsily. A Zuvembe is no longer human. It knows neither relatives nor friends. It is one with the people of the black world. It commands the natural demons, owls, bats, snakes and werewolves, and can fetch darkness to block out a little light. It can be slain by lead or steel, but unless it is slain thus it lives forever, and it eats no such food as humans eat. It dwells like a bat in a cave or an old house. Time means naught to the Zuvembi, an hour, a day, a year, all is one. It cannot speak human words, nor think as a human thinks, but it can hypnotise the living by the sound of its voice. And when it slays a man, it can command his lifeless body until the flesh is cold. As long as the blood flows, the corpse is its slave. Its pleasure lies in the slaughter of human beings.
And why should one become a Zuvembi?
Hate, whispered the old man. Hate. Revenge.
Was her name Joan?
It was as if the name penetrated the fogs of senility that clouded the voodoo man's mind. He shook himself and the film faded from his eyes, leaving them hard and gleaming as wet black marble. Joan, he said slowly. I have not heard that name for the span of a generation. I seem to have been sleeping, gentlemen. I do not remember. I ask your pardon. Old men fall asleep before the fire, like old dogs. You ask me of Blassonville Manor? Sir, if I were to tell you why I cannot answer you, you would deem it mere superstition. And then he gets bit by a snake and killed out of his woodpile. A snake with a white crescent on its head. Oh my God!
Interestingly, I feel by pushing him, they led to that.
Well, he did say that the snake's little brother would come and get him. So yeah, there's some problematic stuff in there, especially the reference to the woods darky. And there's that, again, that Orientalism kind of, picture of voodoo as a mysterious dark force from the dark continent. It is problematic to read today, but nevertheless, it's still effective.
Yes.
And I know sensitivity readers are a thing. This is a product of its time, and we just need to face it head on and react to it accordingly.
You could take out less than a dozen words.
Yeah.
They're the bits. And I think it is of that time. It's not right, but it was of that time.
Yeah, it's attitude prevalent of the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
When we looked at it, we did go into it with Dave, some of the letters that he wrote to Lovecraft and just how appalling some of his attitudes were. But this is a good horror story.
It is.
Poor old geezer is deed, but there is a final twist in the tale because they do decide to go back to the house, to the manor house, and lay in wait and wait for the whistle from upstairs. The whistle does come. Bruckner is the one who stays downstairs on this occasion, and it's Griswell who finds himself hypnotised and dreaming that he's climbing a hill.
I was really shocked. I thought that maybe the fact the first time he woke up just before, he was somehow not susceptible. So, and you don't realise at the start that he is the one who's climbing up the stairs.
Yeah.
And when he does, I'm like, this is a twist I wasn't expecting.
Yeah. Well, this, of course, is after they find part of an account, a notebook, a diary in some old ashes in a fire. And it's the diary
youngest,
of the youngest, Elizabeth Bassendale. And she...
Bassonville?
Whatever it was, Bassonville. Yeah. And it's pretty horrifying, and she at one point thinks that she has a dream where she finds her three sisters hanged in a secret room, which is pretty horrific.
But when he first dreamed, he thought he saw three shapes hanging as well, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. And she thinks that there's a secret room somewhere in the house, and men go to try and find the secret room. They don't find it. But to cut a long story short, actually, it's quite a short story. Griswell is the one who gets hypnotised into climbing the stairs, is very, very close to death. But fortunately, there's a loud bang from a gun. Bruckner shoots the figure that is in the house, and they find that it creeps back, hideously injured through
an opening,
a secret hatch in a wall, this vague figure that looks like a woman, but no woman that ever walked with that skulking gait, and no human woman ever had that face of horror, that leering yellow blare of lunacy. But the shooter, they find their way into the room, and they do indeed find three hanged, mummified bodies. But there is a final twist. So they have defeated the Zuvembi. But, it says, Griswold cried out, "My God, it's the windowless chamber I saw in my dream with the three bodies hanging." Bruckner's light played about the circular chamber, becoming suddenly motionless. In that wide ring of light, three figures appeared, three dried, shriveled, mummy-like shapes, still clad in the mouldering garments of the last century. Their slippers were clear of the floor as they hung by their withered necks. from chains suspended from the ceiling. But it gets more horrifying, because we think at this point that this is Joan, don't we?
Yeah.
Joan, the mulatto servant who was hideously treated, who did this to get revenge.
Well, she would tie her naked to a tree and whip her. Horsewhipped?
Yeah.
Horsewhipped.
Yeah. Absolutely horrific. But there's a final twist. Was that thing a woman once? Whispered Griswell. God, look at that face, even in death. Look at those claw-like hands with black talons like those of a beast. Yes, it was human, though even the rags of an old ballroom gown. Why should a mulatto maid wear such a dress, I wonder?
This has been her lair for over 40 years, muttered Buckner, brooding over the grinning, grisly thing sprawling in the corner. This clears you, Griswell. A crazy woman with a hatchet. That's all the authorities need to know. God, what a revenge! What a foul revenge! Yet what a bestial nature she must have had in the beginning, to delve into voodoo as she must have done.
The mulatto woman, whispered Griswell, dimly sensing a horror that overshadowed all the rest of the terror.
Buckner shook his head. Griswell, I understand now. The mulatto woman had her revenge, but not as we supposed. She didn't drink the black brew old Jacob fixed for her. It was for somebody else, to be given secretly in her food or coffee, no doubt. Then Joan ran away, leaving the seeds of the hell she had sowed to grow.
That's not the mulatto woman, whispered Griswell.
When I saw her out there in the hall, I knew she was no mulatto, and those distorted features still reflect a family likeness. I've seen her portrait, and I can't be mistaken. There lies the creature that was once Celia Blassonville.
Ooh. A nice twist in the tale. I really enjoyed the story, and not only that, but I think the final twist, I really like the fact that it passes no judgment on the revenge of Joan, on her cruel tormentor, who did frankly get a truly horrific comeuppance in that she ended up in that Zuvembi form, punishing her entire family, murdering her own daughters, hanging them up with chains in this secret room, things she had done to other people's daughters and other people's sons, other people's husbands and wives, and punishing her entire family with the one exception of that one daughter that fled to California.
I mean, I must be honest, I was like, Joan? But she was just a horsewhipped maid who was trapped terribly. But then they were saying she did Jacob say she'd done voodoo and she was of an age? So I thought, oh, maybe I've missed. So I was like, that sat better with me, the twist at the end. But it was still a twist.
A great story.
It was a great story and really well written, despite a few lines that we both would remove.
Yeah.
Some of the bit about the baby brother with its cold lips, the kiss of its cold lips, I thought was fantastic.
Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff. And I enjoyed The Haunter of the Ring for how mildly hysterical it was, and also for that like detective tale. But that is a really fucking fantastic spooky tale.
Yes, it is.
It's a great spooky tale. Well, that is 2 spooky Robert E. Howard tales we've done for this latest birthday special, 5 years after the last time you read a Robert E. Howard story, The Tower of the Elephant.
And I have to say, I loved them both. They were good choices.
Yeah, I think, acknowledging some of the hairier attitudes, really, really good stories. But you know what? It's that time now. I've drunk my chili beer. It was lovely. Thanks, Ian and Ange. I'm going to finish off my limoncello. You've got a glass of wine to finish off. And our table is ready for us at the restaurant in 28 minutes.
Better get a shit.
So we're going to go for your birthday dinner.
Fabulous.
So thank you, Phil, and happy birthday. And thank you for talking to us about Robert E. Howard on our 100th episode.
I've enjoyed every minute of it. And can I say happy birthday to Michael Moorcock? Happy
birthday, Michael Moorcock. And I think a lot of people will be listening to this in the run-up to Christmas. So, Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
And we'll see you again very soon for episode 101.
101.
For which we have a plan which involves largely slagging things off and drinking loads of booze.
It's a great plan.
It's a great plan. Wait. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Massive thanks to Mike for talking and being such a legend, to Linda for hooking us up and keeping us to time, and to Joe Monty for prompting me, stopping me procrastinating for another 5 years, and putting me in touch with Linda in the first place. And thanks as always to our patrons for keeping this show on the road and taking us all the way to 100 episodes. When I first started doing this as something to keep me busy, I had no idea of what would follow, not only in terms of knocking out so many shows, but in connecting to so many incredible people across the globe and making so many new friends along the way. So first, those without tier, Anthony Piconti. Anthony, I owe you a podcast still. I haven't forgotten, and I will drop you a line in the new year to that effect. And Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And our chaos engineers, Ed Von Stout, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Ben Hagar, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner-Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Salks, Michael Hopwood, Nick Hopkinson, Ofer Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, and Simon Perrins. And of course, thanks to our crafty jugaderos, Christian Hundal, Graham Holden, Kevin Williams, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Murray Palmer, Sean Twist, Toby White, Taylor Lavery, and a new arrival to play the decks of chance, Adrian Tchaikovsky. An eternal thanks to our patron demons, Action Edmonds, Alistair Davison, Andrew Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Derek Clunan, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Janie Stim, Jason Vogel, Joachim Sund, Joe Monty, Johan Hjapper, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Marius Latauskas, Mark Hebden, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Milazzo, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last but never least, Robert McMillan. Okay, enough of my blather. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can find me on Blue Sky where I'm Stimbot5000. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. But for now, thank you for 100, and take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.